Welcome to the final colloquium lecture of the fall semester. My name is Linda Vita. I'm the director of the Water Resources Center Archives that you see here on the campus. And we're the major sponsor of this lecture series. Of course, we have many financial sponsors across campus and some from off campus. I won't thank them by name tonight. They have been thanked before, but we do appreciate their sponsorship. And I also want to thank the Colloquium Committee, who meets most of the time virtually to discuss the speakers that we're going to have for the next semester. So I want to thank Professor Joe Sachs and Matt Condolf, Michael Hanneman, David Sedlak, and Professor Narasimhan. And also want to let you know that we do have the spring series of speakers set. Starting in February, Randy Poole from Sonoma County Water Agency and Buzz Thompson following in March from Stanford Law. Heather Cooley from Pacific Institute will talk about desalination, and the final speaker in May is Thomas Dunn from UC Santa Barbara. And those will be up on our website soon. Just to let you know that in the back of the room we have a sign-up sheet. If you are not currently receiving reminders about the upcoming lectures, please sign that sheet. We do not send a lot of extraneous email to you, so don't worry about that. And we also have some brochures. And one final thing is we've just published our, 8th calendar or whatever. It's on the Delta. It's 2008. So there are order forms in the back of the room if you'd like to have your very own copy of this collector's item. So with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Matt Condolf, who will introduce our speaker.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to have as our speaker tonight Chris Benton, who is not one of the usual suspects in California water. He has approached it from another level, from above. Chris is an architect with broad interests. He's taught here at Berkeley for 25 years. He's recovering from having been department chair for a number of years. And since 1995, he has had a website about his aerial photography from kites. And we asked him to speak in the lecture series here about California water because some of his images of streams and wetlands have become cult classics on the internet, particularly his image of Cordnesis Creek, a restoration project, and as that has evolved over time. So without further ado, Chris, pleasure to have you here. I guess that's what you have to do.
Thank you, Matt, and it's a pleasure to be here. I love talking about this topic, and I don't get that much of an opportunity. And it's, as Matt mentioned, I'm not one of the usual suspects, that I'm coming at this with a technique, with sort of a passion for a way of looking at the landscape, which is really as simple as lofting a camera using a kite, but has become for me much more complex. It's become a way of interrogating the landscape or thinking about the landscape. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about that technique, and then I'm going to illustrate it with images of wetlands and streams. But before I do that, I have to move this thing, which is a Dopero. This is my lightest wind kite. It's a gossamer thing for very low winds, only fly up to about 6 miles an hour. But it's a great kite under those circumstances. The spar spans about 14 feet with a little rod that's thinner than a pencil, reinforced with carbon fiber. Fabulous stuff. So if I can get, this going, that, and 2 switches over here. So here we go. I'll elaborate just a little further on myself. I teach in the building science group here at Cal, where a lot of my research is quantitative. I'm an empiricist at heart, And so we do laboratory and field studies. We do a lot of post-occupancy evaluation of buildings. We want to know how things work, sort of curious about whether design ideas pan out or not. In teaching, I use a lot of experiential exercises in teaching. So again, I'm trying to encourage students to make things and to experiment and to sort of have ideas that they test empirically or in the field. So a lot of hands-on stuff. And then in my own work, I tend to gravitate toward invention. So I just like building things. I'm afraid this piece on the left is a thermal measurement cart that we run through office buildings. You flip one switch and it takes about 9,000 readings in a 5-minute period to very carefully, in a detailed fashion, characterize the local thermal environment in an office. So it's doing laboratory grade measurements in the field. This is a heliodon, or a shadow casting table, for doing sunlight access studies using scale models. It's over at the Pacific Energy Center in San Francisco. But when I'm not doing that stuff, I'm also have been for a long time a photographer. I was very lightly complected during my undergraduate years because I spent so much time in the darkroom. If I think about the photographers that have influenced me over the years, I put up 4 of them. And I've got up here Edward Muybridge in his locomotion studies or time sequence studies, Howard Edgerton's freezing of just a microsecond of time with a strobe. We've got Charles and Ray Eames' Powers of 10 exposition about scale. And then finally, a local photographer, William Garnett, who was an aerial photographer that did fine art landscapes in medium format. I think what all of these photographers did is they took photography and they employed it. They developed it as an art in a way that reveals to us things that we can't capture with our native senses. Things that are too fast or from a different point of view or too slow. And so Muybridge, who started life as, Muybridge started life as Muggeridge and ended up as Helios, said he was neither a physiologist or an anatomist, but he shaped a lot the study of locomotion and physiology and anatomy. Charles and Ray Eames with what is my favorite design quote of all time: "What looks good can change, but what works, works," with their Powers of 10. We have Howard Edgerton, who had his strobe laboratory at MIT, kept the door open, and you could go in and sort of chat with him. And he's talking about the experience of seeing the unseen has provided him with insights and questions all his life. And then finally, William Garnett, who talked about height, aeronautical altitude, as being sudden wealth. And that shows, that passion for height and what it reveals shows in his work. So today I'm going to go through a set of slides that talks a little bit about the history of photography from low levels, and particularly the golden age of kite photography, which was around the beginning of the 20th century. I'll talk about the equipment and technique that I use, a little bit about motivation, and then I'll illustrate it by showing some images of East Bay creeks. I'll have a few slides from Heron's Head Park over in San Francisco, and then the place that I go the most, the South Bay Salt Ponds, down below the San Mateo Bridge. And I'll preface all that by saying I've been going out and hiking around the bay now for 20 years and enjoying it a great deal. And when I started taking photographs, I would take photographs from around the edge of the bay. Here's Point Bonita. And I realized from these aerial photographs that you would start to notice things. I had stood here maybe 10 times without noticing the outline of the foundation of what was the 3rd in Command's station out at Point Bonita. Not a desirable post, as it turned out. Or here's a strip on San Pedro Road near China Camp, where as you look down, you can start to see the relationships between the natural landscape and the sort of built landscape in the form of the road and paths. And you can see the interface between the two. Oops. Sorry. I seem to have... That's what happens when you turn your back on the slides. If you've been to McNear's Beach, near that same spot, it's a nice sort of beach, a park-like setting. You can hear machinery sort of grinding around in the background, and that's the machinery from this McNear's quarry, the rock quarry that Dura owns on the point. A desirable quarry, I understand, because it can offload directly into barges. What was once a large hill is now a very large hole, which is a bit of a theme around the bay. Looking at the edge in a cityscape sense, here, Cesar Chavez Park in Berkeley, looking straight down, or Crissy Field in San Francisco, before it was modified. And then you go back and you see that, okay, well, now there's a lagoon, and it's been modified quite a bit. And that also, I think, is a characteristic of the edge of the bay, that it is in play and has been in play for a long time. Well, this desire to see things from on high, from the heights, is, I think, a basic human characteristic. Before photography existed, we had aerial perspectives. And basically, as soon as surveying and the science of perspective matured enough, people were creating aerial views. It goes back to, I think, the 1600s, beginning with a view in Venice. And there was a sort of heyday, if you will, in the 19th century, constructed perspectives of many, many cities. This one of San Francisco shows much more of the original shoreline. Here's the Golden Gate out here. The basin has not been filled in. Hunters Point way down at the end where Heron's Head Park will be. And then photography arrives, and it wasn't terribly long after photography that people figured out a way to get it in the air. The nascent science, if you would call it that, of ballooning. There was a Frenchman, Félix Tourneschon, who lifted cameras in a balloon and took the first aerial photographs. His photographs were regrettably lost. As a side note, I think he was whisked off to the French-Italian front within just 9 months of taking the first aerial photograph, and that began the history of aerial photography for military purposes. It's been closely coupled since. The oldest extant photograph, aerial photographs, a James Wallace Black image from 1860 of Boston. So there was a beginning, and then it really matured. By the time we got to the end of World War I, aerial photography was very well developed from fixed-wing aircraft. In between, there was wonderful invention. I love this image of a German rocket scientist on a horse, where they would launch a large format camera. That was about an 8-inch square plate on this rocket, and it would tumble a bit, but they would get back very high-quality images. Or there was Pigeon aerial photography, which a number of entrepreneurs did, where they would strap ingenious little cameras to pigeons, often actuated by a fuse. I don't know what the Pigeon thought about that. And they would let it go, and there would be some random moment of exposure. This is actually a swing lens panoramic camera, which produced this nice long image. Really advanced cameras in order to do that for their day. The first kite aerial photographs attributed to a French farmer, Arthur Batut, in 1887. He never really much left the province where he was born, but an ingenious guy. He mounted a camera directly to a kite, wrote a book about it. So here's his kite. It was paper at times, or cloth, on a heavy wood frame. When I say he's ingenious, he actually sort of incorporated in his camera a barometer, so that the needle of the barometer left a shadow on the film when it was exposed, and thus encoded the height of the kite above the surface, which I thought was really fabulous. If I read, at least, his book in the current day, it's really like listening to a pier, except for their stretches about using horses to pull the kite. And he apparently is not worried about telegraph or telephone wires too much. Kite photography remained quite vogue for a while. Here we have Lawrence Hargrave and Alexander Graham Bell, both big kite folks. Hargrave being really a pretty major aerodynamicist. There were notions of person lifting kites, which a few poor people got pulled around behind battleships, but that was not a big thing. William Eddy, who invented this diamond-shaped kite, had the distinction of dropping the most cameras, I think. He dropped one on the halls of Congress. He dropped a camera this size on Manhattan from a great height. I don't think the legal system had quite gotten up to the level of precision it has now to deal with such matters. This is a famous kite air photograph by George Lawrence. It was taken 2 weeks after the San Francisco earthquake. Lawrence lifted with a train of 7 kites a 50-pound panoramic camera that exposed an image that was 18 inches by 50 images. He became really quite wealthy selling contact prints from that negative. It's wonderfully detailed. The Library of Congress will allow you to download a full resolution version of it, where you see individuals and little campfires and people camping. So fast forward to the current day in terms of technique. There are really not very many places where you can go buy kite aerial photography equipment. And so you have to adapt and make things yourself. It's a nice thing if you like to do workbench tinkering. There's now one person in Pacific Grove, a guy named Brooks Leffler, who will sell kits to do it. But I sort of just sketch stuff up and make it myself. For instance, that peak of a cross, the suspension cross, is made out of the arms of an old 10 megabyte hard drive. And so my basement is full of things that have been taken apart. I'm a hacker in that regard. And then you put them back together. So I use bearings out of floppy drives, various found parts. And to make a photography rig, you take a camera and you work outward so that everything is balanced. And it typically has 4 channels of input. One will rotate from horizontal to vertical landscape to portrait mode. One rotates around the compass, so you can point in different directions. Another channel and motor will tilt from straight down to the horizon. And then a 4th one will fire the shutter. And so you can build those then around different cameras. I've built around 10. I think. And I've got, after the lecture, if you'd like to look, I've got 2 on the table over here, the ones I'm currently using. So I have, you can build them around single lens reflex cameras. Here's the smallest one, which is less than a pound for a 5 megapixel digital camera. It has video transmitting down, which I've done 3 times, but never really use. If you transmit video down, you can have an electronic viewfinder, but it's a bit of a hassle in the field. I've done, as part of a stint over the Exploratorium, a $5 version that uses silly putty and rubber bands so that you can do it without radios. That was in Make magazine. And of late, I've been doing more and more panoramic photography, and the rig there just points a fisheye lens straight down so that it captures an entire hemisphere below the camera. You can then couple that with a hemisphere above the camera and see the entire scene around the point of view where the camera was placed. From that comes a virtual reality panorama. Kites. I don't know, when I was young, we used to go to the dime store, they had dime stores, and we would buy paper kites. High Flyer was the brand. And they never really flew very well. If you really sort of fussed with them, you'd get they were eddy-shaped, typically diamond-shaped. There was always something about the tail that you needed that eluded me somehow. I couldn't get it tuned. And I've learned now that kite flying has a lot to do with the drape of the fabric and the way it hangs on the frame, and that paper really didn't do a very good job of draping across the frame. If you'd crumpled it up and gotten it soft, it probably would have done better. Today, you really don't have to use paper. We're using ripstop nylon and carbon fiber. These are elegant sort of combinations of material to produce a stable aerodynamic platform. When I go out in the field, I typically have 5 kites. And they range from little tiny things. So this is the kite I would use if it were blowing about 20. And it's sort of small and mean like a cat. It sort of puts its ears back, but it is stable with a tail. That'll lift 3 pounds and do it nicely. And then the big kite here, the red one, I would use if the wind is less than maybe 6 miles an hour. And so it's like golf clubs. You pull out a kite to fit the conditions, to fit what you're trying to do. I keep my rigs less than 3 pounds so that I can always be at the end holding the kite rather than having to tie it off to things. George Lawrence's kite that was lifting 50 pounds, they had to anchor that to a military winch that was staked into the ground. It was not particularly mobile. So these are air-inflated kites called Sutton Flowforms. So they're no sticks. They just sort of roll up and go in your pack like a windbreaker. I have those in 8, 16, 30, and 60 square feet. And then they're framed kites. This is a rokaku, which is a Japanese geometry, a 6-sided kite that I use a lot. And the one against the wall here is called a dopero. So there's the dopero. Again, 14 feet spanned with about a pencil diameter element. So why do people do this? And there are, when I started, I think there were perhaps 2 dozen, 3 dozen people that did it. There are now more and more. We gather on occasion. The internet has brought people together. I think some will really come at it through the kites. They have kites, they like kites, and would like to do something sort of fun with them. I think others, like myself, are coming at kite photography through photography. They have a passion for photography, and this gives a point of view that is otherwise difficult to achieve. I think some begin with the academy and some applied dimension. I was just talking to Matt Condolf about documenting streams. I've had wonderful connections through this with people from computer science and biology and space science, a whole series of things, geomorphology. Some are just tinkerers and like to invent things. They like to play with microcontrollers, for instance, which are sort of the current topic. Some strive to be the lightest. I have friends in Germany who paradoxically strive to be the heaviest. They like big, heavy, solid things and think they get steadier photographs from it. I think some find it to be an incredibly social act. And if I go through introspection, I think almost all of these apply to me. And it's a mode of creative self-expression that I enjoy a lot, thinking through a shot and actually then getting it. There's a part of it that teaches you to be patient, because getting light and wind and yourself and the terrain all together at the same time requires a bit of patience. It's fun. If I go out and fly a kite and don't get photographs, I'm still a pretty happy camper. I like the community I've gotten to know through this. It is a social act. This is better than a dog or a baby or anything that might bring up strangers to say hello. It's a mechanism for opening doors into other disciplines, but most importantly for me, it's become a means to engage the landscape, to really think about the terrain, the geography, the settings in which I live, and to ask questions of them. And I'll try to illustrate that. Here's the fun patience part. It really is fun going out and flying kites. The global village, we somehow gather about 50 people now once a year somewhere. Someone says, okay, we'll meet in Scotland this year. And so everybody finds their way to Scotland. This was at Pacific Grove 2002, and we met again in Pacific Grove in 2006. The Global Village website thing, I think 20 years ago, people had to invent this in isolation. There weren't very many ways to know that this guy in Scotland was doing something interesting, but with the web, there is. And so websites. The social thing, I've become friends with law enforcement officers. I was invited to a wedding in La Jolla just because I was nearby flying a kite. Had a great time with these folks. This trucker pulled his big rig off the side of the road and talked to me for a very long time, but with great interest. And so it's wonderful. So many people come around. This is our T-shirt that we've shared with each other, which are the standard questions on the back of the T-shirt. You refer people to the back and say, get back to me if that doesn't cover it. I go through the notion or the process often of designating a docent, and I explain everything carefully to the docent, and then they hang out for the next couple of hours, happily it always seems, explaining it to other people so that I'm released of that burden. I mentioned before that you can send video down as a viewfinder of sorts, and that I don't do that. I think the principal reason I don't do it is that I enjoy composing the image mentally. That actually the biggest thing I get from this is to watch that speck flying around, position it, aim it, and try to imagine what does it see. In a way, that's forming a hypothesis. You know, what will be seen from that point of view? This is a very sort of architectural bird's eye perspective thing. What I found is that when I get the image back, there's always something to challenge the hypothesis. There's always something different. It causes you to think about why you formed the hypothesis in the first place, and then to start looking for those things that you notice in the photographs. So there's that immediate level of hypothesis to image comparison. I think also when you start to look at these images, you'll find a whole series of other questions that emerge that really weren't part of your original hypothesis. These images just sort of beg questions. Why is that there? Why is that trail? Why are these different widths? What is that texture about? And so I go out trying to shoot things on purpose. This is a comparison of Daytona Beach with the beach just south of it, the Canaveral National Seashore Beach, with totally undeveloped island. And I had not, as someone probably sensitive to built things, had not really appreciated how quickly this Daytona Beach strip thinned out as you went toward the intercoastal waterway, and how just within a very short distance, compressed by the space of the island, it went from commercial, sort of a horrible sort of strip, exuberant commercial, to a very calm residential. And so I travel with this bag of gear. Everything over here fits in one really fairly modest backpack, and I'm able to be quite mobile with it. And so I've taken it, and I'm doing villages in Europe. This is going out to the son of Krakatau cinder cone that's coming up where the volcano Krakatau blew up in Sumatra or on the English coast. But what I'm going to try to illustrate with today is to talk about the aqueous landscape, water. And the one thing that I'll throw in here first is that a lot of these shots have come in the context of something called the Hidden Ecologies project. And the Hidden Ecologies project came out of a stint I had over at the Exploratorium as an artist in residence. I just thought of the Exploratorium just says do neat stuff, basically. It challenges you to do that. And I became friends as part of this with a guy named Wayne Lanier, who's a microbiologist on the edge of retirement. And Wayne and I started hiking together. Wayne was working on a book called Hiking with a Field Microscope. And so he took photographs in the field through his microscope, and I was taking photographs in the field from my sort of slightly odd perspective, and we found that they complemented each other actually quite well. And so I would take photographs of Wayne sampling. Here's Wayne from above, and we would later couple those with the images of the microorganisms that he got from that environment. Here's the Swift FM31 field microscope. I became so interested in these things that I went out and got one, so I now have a bedroom full of smelly stuff just like Wayne. It's my chance as an architect to go through biology courses that I hadn't had before. And so in the Hidden Ecologies project, we imagine ourselves, and I don't really expect you to read this, but I throw it up nevertheless, is spanning a number of scale bands. If you go to Google Earth, for instance, and I do adore Google Earth, you can go from the width of the globe at 10 to the 7th meters down to detail that starts to run out at about 10 to the 2nd meters. It really starts to get fuzzy. With my kite, I can go from 10 to the 2nd very nicely down to a meter, because you can take photographs from just 1 or 2 meters above the ground, or you can take photographs from 100 meters up. Then standing on the ground, you can span from 10 meters down to 10 to the -2 postage stamp size. And then with Wayne's microscope, you can go from 10 to the -2 down to 10 to the -5. And so with stuff we can just put in a backpack, plus Google Earth, we can go from 10 to the 7th down to 10 to the -5th. And that's a remarkable range for going out and sort of engaging a landscape, taking photographs. We have identified a series of sites, and again, I don't expect you to read that, I just grabbed the image. And it's, the South Bay is a big one. We've been doing the Green Bay Boardwalk, Crissy Field, Heron's Head. We've done Lake Merced, and that's sort of the gamut so far. And so now I'll leap over to the water images and the creeks. There was a bit of trepidation as I went about illustrating this talk with creek images in the local area. I had a hard time finding creek images that appealed to my sort of visual sensibilities. That may say something about our creeks. I've gone out and at various people's requests taken shots. Here's Richmond looking over the development and a little bit of the wetlands in the near ground. And again, Richmond, this is Mission Bay, is that the development in Richmond around the harbor? Harbor Bay. And so sort of cheek to jowl houses that then just sort of run out right here at the edge of Meeker Creek. And then you go across the other side of Meeker Creek and a whole series of images. It's a very ad hoc landscape once you get there with all sorts of traces of things past, little levees and hummocks. But it seems as though a landscape that no one particularly owns these days. I know there's some remedial work going on. And then the Bay Trail coming through over this bridge. Or here up in Pinole and Pinole Creek, where we have a sort of a creek environment that has been channelized, and I guess in part for protection of these stored recreational vehicles that are in what sort of reads like a floodplain to me. And so here's the creek coming, boom, straight through the town. I went and did Baxter Creek. This is just off San Pablo Avenue in El Cerrito. And I'm afraid these photographs don't read terribly well. They're stitched panoramas looking at a stretch of Baxter Creek where it emerges from a culvert and is above ground until it goes underneath San Pablo Avenue. Perhaps a more useful view, though not a particularly glamorous one, is just a plan view looking straight down. I love the detail that comes out of these plan view photographs taken from 10 meters high or perhaps 15 meters high. There's an extraordinary amount of detail. And so here, a newly installed walk with rocks at the end. Who knows what that was about? Probably a no parking strategy. Baxter Creek then comes down and runs into Hoffman Marsh, which seems to have survived. And there's a story there somewhere about why Hoffman Marsh is not like a lot of other places. And so here looking north and south across the Hoffman Marsh, Albany Hill in the background, and then going to the lower Cordoneses Creek area where my kids played soccer. I had earlier photographs of that site before any action was taken on it, but they're all of kids playing soccer, unfortunately. I wish I had shot that straight stream. So here, Albany Hill, the University Village housing development, and a series of photographs of this stream. What would you call this stream? Is this a stream restoration project, or a stream modification project, or a stream tidying up project? Well, it's clearly a stream project in which they've sort of worked on the floodplain a bit. They've put in a meander where it was, I do recall, a straight shot down a concrete-lined ditch to get to the bay, overgrown with blackberries. I caught a snake there one time. And so now here's a meander. And it was fun sort of watching this project going on. There's a soccer goal on one edge. It's flanked by soccer fields on the Albany and Berkeley side. And so there'll be a series of dates. I've been there 9 times now. I just sort of stop by every now and then. It's easy to fly from the soccer field. And so here we have October 2004, in which it's sort of pristinely laid out, and all the matting is on the ground. The edges have been protected against erosion. Looking pretty close to that 6 months later, the winter has begun in 2005. We're seeing a little bit of green. The turf seed has taken root, but not a whole lot of other. I talked to the bridge people that worked on that bridge. They're very proud of it. And now by May 2005, the green has taken over a bit more. But it's low. There's not much growing, but it's starting to fill in by the end of that summer. By September, we're starting to see the willows exert a presence out of the creek bed. And then I think what happened is that this winter of Alt 5, Alt 6 was a little hard on it. We're seeing this stuff sort of start to take toll. These are just a couple of months apart, November and January. And then I came back in the spring. You do see water there in January. And it had been knocked back a fair bit. I think a lot of water must have swept through. But by March 2007, spring has sprung and it's coming back with vigor. And having been there, last time I was there was September, and these willows are now up at 3 or 5 meters high. They've really taken hold. And so there they are. And you can imagine them filling out very nicely from now on. There's a big section upstream that's been worked on since this began. I have a series of photographs of that. So here we're looking up the stream bed into more populated areas, and then looking back over Golden Gate Fields horse storage area toward the bay in September 2007. Going across the bay to Heron's Head Park. Now, Heron's Head was sort of picked out by my microbiologist friend. He became really interested in Heron's Head, and it's would have been the southmost pier in the San Francisco pier system, something like Pier 90 something, but they never really got the pier built. And so it's just basically leftover land. The stuff was dumped there. I think at one point when they were thinking about that being the landing for the Bay Bridge that wasn't built, another Bay Bridge crossing. There was a Lash Lighter Basin effort in which people invested money in a transportation system that really didn't take off. And so that folded. It seemed to be sort of a place of lost dreams in a lot of ways. That was good for nature. Because it was never developed, it developed, there we go, developed a series of, basically a little wetland along this peninsula of debris. And so here's a panorama looking from out over the water back toward, that was where the Hunters Point power plant was, where there was a great deal of discussion about environmental justice. And I guess the star of our Heron's Head sort of encounter has been cyanobacteria in the mats that they form in the pools at Heron's Head. My microbiologist friend is really interested in those mats. And they come and go, they prosper, and then they dry out and become fluffy. And he's been doing a lot of measurement there, trying to figure out, well, what are the patterns that cause these mats to develop. And so there's Wayne. And I take a lot of photographs there of Wayne and the sites that he samples in his microbiological sort of workup of Heron's Head. After a while, that gets a little old. You know, you've been to these pools a few times, and I mean, it's always nice to go over there. Here's one of our sample sites up the peninsula, and then another one. I've got these at various scales and heights, at various seasons, various times of the day. It is very well documented in terms of kite aerial photographs. I think the thing that I came away from this, and one of the attractions for me, has been that this pursuit of taking aerial photographs opens doors. And so I started reading about this land where Heron's Head was, to try to figure out what shaped that landscape. How do you interpret the landscape? And it's fascinating over there. That whole southern section of the San Francisco Bay coastline has been extensively modified. There have been these epochs of sort of industrial might. There used to be something called Long Bridge that went from San Francisco proper across China Basin and then through a big V that was blasted out of Potrero Point. Potrero Point's not there anymore. It got reduced to rubble and thrown into the marsh to make it non-marsh. And so this big V was here, and then there was another bridge that continued on. Right at that knuckle was where they displaced all the butchers in San Francisco because it was sort of an unsightly thing in the city proper, so they sent them down on this bridge and they would throw the offal into the marsh, probably helping some things and hurting others. Does anybody know where that bridge led? That whole system? 1870s? Racehorses. It led to a racehorse track, which was apparently a very popular thing, and that was the destination at the end of Long Bridge. Long Bridge became Kentucky Avenue, which became 3rd Street in the current day. And so there's just a lot of fascinating reading about how that neighborhood has gone through change. It had a China camp shrimp fishing operation. Here, stewardesses and captains of industry were charting the second bridge that never really happened. And then to the South Bay. And so if I'm generally interested in things that occur along the edge of San Francisco Bay, I am really interested in this South Bay landscape. I almost threw in a traffic map because the South Bay for me for 15 years was this thing I sort of drove around trying to avoid traffic congestion. Oh, should I take this bridge or that? I think if I had a mental image of it, it was probably a mental image of bay, open water. But it's not that at all. It was once an incredible, as I'm sure you know, estuary wetland, a marsh, and it has been for quite a few decades now largely devoted to salt resource extraction in the form of salt precipitation. And my son did a high school paper about it, and on a whim we stopped and sort of walked around a little bit of the place that he had done his paper on, and I became sort of hooked on it. Access to the South Bay is actually very nice now. The Bay Trail efforts have provided public access along a large part of it. The other portions in the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge and the California Fish and Game Eden Preserve are off limits, and the cargo lands. You probably see it in the paper a lot. I think just recently there were articles about the crystallization plants over on the Redwood City side of things being offered, or they're thinking about offering it for sale and development. And there's this whole dance about how much gets developed at the edge. I think the Cargill Corporation has also come to realize that they don't need as many acres in production for salt. At one point they were producing something like 100 million tons of salt a year, 3% of which would provide the table salt for the western United States. And so they've reduced the acreage in production and have sold a large number of acres in the tens of thousands to coalitions of federal, state, municipal, and foundation entities for wildlife habitat restoration and flood control. So there's a lot in the news about it. If I went out there and walked, when I first went with my son, you get out there, and my impressions were that there was sort of a timelessness to it, that it was incredibly flat. You get out there, and there, other than the Coyote Hills, there's no point of prospect, and that it goes through cycles as I went in periodic times. This is a pool from which we've been sampling microorganisms now for about 5 years, and so we watch that pool a lot. It gets a really nice non-sulfur fixing purple bacteria floating in it. And so it's just fun watching that landscape. If you go out there and walk, you also immediately notice wildlife, abundant wildlife that take advantage of the salt pond habitats. These photographs were taken within just an hour, I think, on a walk. And you notice color. I think that's probably the most characteristic piece. As you're landing at SFO, you get to look down during the day. I always get a window seat just so I can watch the ponds on approach. And they are these incredibly vivid colors, bright greens, dark greens, oranges, reds, mauves, vermilions, and so forth. Those colors all relating, to the microorganisms that go through a series of successions as salinity increases in the ponds. So very low salinity, there's a low salt tolerant cyanobacteria, and then you get dinoflagellates or things like Daniella salina here in the middle. And then finally it gets up into very specialized high salt halophiles that are archaeobacteria. As you go out and walk, you're not as particularly struck with the color. You're standing next to large bodies of water, and as you look out, what you largely see on large bodies of water are sky reflection. And so one of the things I first noticed with my kite photography is that by taking the camera and pointing it down from above, you basically eliminate most of the sky reflection. And you can see both the color of the water and some detail below. And so as you look down, you start to see textures and colors. I may, just for this quick set of slides, now, there was one light. There. I may make this just a little dark because the colors are really nice out there. And so here up toward the crystallization ponds, you're getting these sort of rich purples. The gradient here going to blue is as sky reflection picks up with an increasing angle of incidence. This is Maori Slough, once navigable, but now pretty much all filled in. And flanking that, a high salinity pond, which is a wonderful sort of mauve. Here we have greens that would be associated with lower salinities. These are about 12% or 14% salinity, a little platform for duck hunters who take off. There's still duck hunting down there, and this is lower yet. And then reds would be higher salinity, typically getting up in the 20% plus range. So here we have, in both cases, a little field of salt crystallizing as wind spray gets up on the edge of the bank and dries out. Really just sort of fabulous colors. And then the whites and greens. The white would be exposed salt. The green is just the natural marsh, which does exist in vestigial segments down there. The other thing that you can see as you look down from above, and you don't have to fight the reflection of the sky, are the old marsh channels, which are no longer there as ebb and flow channels, but are still very much present in the landscape. These are 1858, 1857 drawings of the marsh. There's the southernmost of the Coyote Hills right here, done by a surveying team for the coastal T-charts. Wonderful, big, detailed maps of what the marshes had been before intervention. You can download these full scale from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And I can go find those exact channels by flying over the salt ponds. And so here on the oblique of the same salt pond, you can sort of recognize the branches that were surveyed in 1857. So as you look down, clearly dendritic marsh channels, sort of frozen. You get a little bit of high ground along the edge of the marsh channels. Along every one of these salt evaporation ponds is a big ditch. That would be the borrow ditch where muck was sort of dredged up by the one dredge that does this, the Mallard II, and plucked down to form the levee. And so along the edge, all of these little divots are the bucket, the one bucket that produces all of the levee size. This is Newark Slough, there and there, coming through, which is between levees, still free flowing. Again, so here we have scoops from the dredge, the borrow ditch, and then all the little dendritic marsh channels that, in a way, are frozen in time. They're just sort of arrested there when the pond became static, or largely static. And then there are a whole series of textures that you find out there. And sort of photographically, I find the textures really interesting and go out looking for traces, in a way. This is a place where duck hunters were launching a boat to get out into a salt pond. So you get a whole series of duck hunter feet imprints. They must have had very messy boots, a hayfield, the verge at the edge of a mud flat. And so now, rather than just talking about general themes, I'm going to, as though a bird, I think that was part of the title, go to 4 areas and just quickly visit those to see what emerged when a camera looked down. And those are going to be up near the Eden Creek Preserve. This is the old course of Alameda Creek. Down near the park, or the Don Edwards headquarters at Dunbarton Point, down near the crystallization ponds, and then finally along the railroad line that goes from Alviso up to Warm Springs. And so the Alameda Creek part, this is actually the first place I went out there before it's now closed up as part of the Eden Nature Preserve. And I was walking out on a levee and I saw this bridge, and I was wondering, well, wait a minute, that's sort of a heavy timber framed bridge. What is it doing going across a salt pond, which should be this little shallow evaporation pond? It really didn't sort of make sense to have such a structure there. And then you look nearby, right around the corner, you saw a field of pilings, large pilings, driven into the marsh at pretty close spacing. And I became really curious about what that was. And it turns out that this was both a landing and a salt evaporation operation back when they were of smaller scale, right next to the old city of Alvarado. And so the landing was at the limit of navigability, practical navigability, of Alameda Creek. And in fact, this little ditch was Alameda Creek before it got channelized for flood control. This is from the Thompson and West 1878 Atlas, which shows, I suspect, a rather grand view of what one of these small salt operations would look like. Windmills to move water from one salt pond to the next, big piles of salt that had been refined, large and presumably deep anchorage for boats. But I think the anchorage was not particularly accommodating, that they had to go in at high tide. I've done a lot of overlaying of old maps on top of the likes of Google Earth images to find where these smaller outfits were. And you can go out and find traces of these still in the landscape. And so if I go look in the bushes where it indicated a building, out of the bushes can come something like this section of vertical grain gutter with still a perfectly mitered corner on it. And so it was a landscape of small operations that were once there that have now largely been erased. Going to Dunbarton Point, the first thing that struck me, if you ever stopped at the toll plaza for the Dunbarton Bridge, if you had a good arm and you threw a rock, you'd throw it over that edge, and it would go down into Dunbarton Quarry, which I'm told, but I have no real way of verifying it yet, is the deepest place in the United States. The quarry was once a 150-foot high hill, that was in the 1970s, and is now a 300-foot deep hole, and they keep getting sort of extensions to go a little bit deeper. And it is a whopping large hole there in the ground with a salt pond at sea level, salt pond right here at sea level that's 300 feet above the bottom of the gravel pit. The whole economies of gravel are really fascinating. Beyond is a place that's now called the La Riviere Marsh, a marsh restoration project that was before Wetlands, but in between those two things was the Arden Salt Works #1. And I became really interested in the Arden Salt Works. You can see it more here. This is the last little knoll of the Coyote Hills where the Don Edwards National Wildlife folks have their headquarters and visitor center. This was quarried. Here's the big quarry down here. The new road coming through to the Dunbarton Bridge. And then this whole plain was once a salt production outfit called Arden Salt Works #1. And as I look, this is a 1937 aerial photograph looking down on that same place. Here's the hill where the park headquarters is. The previous view had been taken up here. Here's the hill that's now the big hole for the Dunbarton Quarry. And here are the last ponds, the evaporation and crystallization ponds for Arden Salt Works #1 with big pile of salt, which was there in process there. And I was curious about how a certain thing worked. If I go back, see a crescent here? This crescent is a distribution basin. If water gets to there, it can be pumped into that pond, this one, that one, and this large one. And then the question became, well, how does water get to that? Because it's on the other side of the Coyote Hills. If you go to the Don Edwards headquarters, you see this nice little picturesque pump house. They keep taking pieces of it off. The pipe's no longer there. And I never really understood what the pump house was pumping to. It was sort of at the end of a succession of salt ponds, but it was unclear what it connected to. And then one day I was on the other side of the hill taking photographs for an interview, and sort of toss-away photographs. I looked at them later and saw this, which you're not aware of when you're standing on the levee. And it's a redwood pipe, sort of an old technology, compression band, as though a barrel redwood pipe. Excuse me. And it's emerges from the marsh to go across the stream. You can see remnants of it there. Once you know to look for it, you can see it. And then it goes into the crescent basin on the left-hand side of the levee. And so knowing that that's there, you could then take an aerial photograph and look for it. There's the crescent. It's actually got splashing water there. The pump house is pumping. And there's the line where that redwood pipe was presumably underground. And they did a tunnel. They bored a tunnel underneath the saddle in the Coyote Hills. Went up about 30 feet. And so they just dug a hole through it. And that connected to the pump house, which is right here. And once you start then looking for that, here's another view from the marsh side. And here's this straight line going through. You can see evidence on the surface that the texture of the marsh is different there, the earth. Here's the crescent with these. They have big, wonderful gates. These are big, sturdy, heavy gates for allowing the water to go into these basins. If you go out at the end of Dunbarton Point, right from the base of Dunbarton Bridge, which is right here, you can see the ruins of an old landing. And I'm really curious, I haven't seen a name applied to this landing. It's in a salt pond, but the salt pond was once a channel in the stream. Here's a view just down the way from the landing showing the Dunbarton Cutoff Bridge. That was the first bridge across San Francisco Bay for the railroad. Again, overlaying maps. Here's the contemporary Dunbarton bridges, the railroad bridge. Hetch Hetchy comes across here. There's actually a pipeline going across that little narrow strait or narrows that pumps salt water from one salt pond to the next. And the remnants of an old salt operation that actually had a railroad spur that came through and ended right where that old landing was. And so it must have been a railroad to water transfer point. And so there's the landing. Also out in that same pond, you can see the remnants of some of the old wind-driven pumps. They had big direct drive windmills turning an Archimedes screw in the case of the Oliver Brothers system, in which the Archimedes screw just lifted water and threw it over the levee. 1,500 gallons a minute when that thing was cranked up. Also nearby, here's the dredge building the levee, or is a swing bridge over Newark Slough. This is a railroad bridge that swung to allow navigation up the slough. Not much navigation these days, and I understand they're going to restore that railroad line to operation about 2 years out. So it'll be interesting to see that. For the crystallization ponds, if you go down to where now all of the salt crystallization for the Bay Area is taking place in Newark at the Cargill crystallization pond, and this is the stack of salt that it produces. At the end of the season, that's a stack of salt about 20 meters high and on the order of 100 and something meters long, 2 stacks of salt that big. These ponds are so saline that even when the wind is blowing, the surface remains unruffled. It's heavy water and wonderful in color. So here we have the whole series of smaller crystallization ponds. This is one that still has brine in it, just about ready to harvest. So it has dropped sodium chloride to the bottom of the pond. Here's one where they stripped off the Benton, the brine that has magnesium chloride and other things in it. And once they expose the bottom, they run a big machine around, sort of like a Zamboni in an ice rink, and they grind up the salt and load it onto trucks. And so you can see the tracks of where that machine has gone around. Right next to that, they're growing hay. And so this is a hay field right by Mallory Slough. This harvester was being driven by an 8-year-old when I was there taking photographs, who was having a great time. Seagulls were enjoying the voles and whatnot that were being thrown up as well. Also right there, within a stone's throw of the crystallization ponds is a pick and pull auto parts place. It must have 1,000 plus demolished vehicles in it. And they are incredibly stealthy. As you drive down the road, you know it's there from a commercial point, but you never really see the expanse of vehicles that are behind the walls. And finally, sort of heading toward a close, the stretch of railroad that still carries the main rail traffic along that corridor towards Santa Cruz. And I was just recently, just this year, I've been to Warm Springs, and I'm really taken with the Warm Springs environment. It's sort of, that's where the new A's Stadium is going to be going next to that, and it's showing a lot of automobile dealerships springing up. But where they have preserved the hummocks and the vernal pools, it is a remarkable landscape. This was probably much the same thing, but got converted to a salt pond at some stage. So you still see hummocks, but they are quite desolate. Here's a spring out in the middle that's sending off some water. And walking around the edge of this, it is for one thing, it's filled with bird bones, for instance. You look at a square meter, and there must be the remains of a dozen birds in it. And they're the remains of a whole series of old works. And that really was sort of the landscape down there. There would be a small operation that did something, and it would get bought out by a larger operation, and all the small stuff would be covered up. And then that would be bought up by another conglomerate until finally Cargill owned everything. But with each of those stages, the scale of operations changed. So this is some old small-scale stuff. Here's one of the springs putting out flow. And then there are a whole series of these features in that landscape. And I haven't figured them out. I'm just recently started puzzling. At the center of a hummock, and the hummock appears to be made by scrapes pulled toward the center, and at the center will be two big vertical redwood barrels, or something that looks like barrels. And I can't figure out how that would have been part of a salt production operation, but it's done at a very local scale. So there's one that has maybe a zone of 50 meters around it, and then there'll be another one outside of that zone. And so here, a closer view of two of the barrels, the hummock. Here's scrape marks filled with what is still pretty saline water. They don't seem to fill that pond very much. And then here's the railroad grade that goes down to Station Island. Station Island's down here. That's where Drawbridge is located, the little abandoned town out in the marsh. Drawbridge sprung up around the railroad, and originally the station keeper there that monitored the bridges and became a duck hunting and recreation area. One point had a couple hundred people living there, but perished in large part due to raw effluent coming out of San Jose, which made it a not very pleasant place in the 60s and 70s, and so it was abandoned. And so there's Drawbridge. This was once Station Island, and a wonderful sort of marsh place. There's still a big triangle of marsh here. But then the island became two different salt ponds, Salt Pond A20 and A21. The railroad is still really quite active, so if you're out there, the trains sort of sneak up on you. Here's a train roaring through Drawbridge, more trains, lots of trains. Drawbridge itself, these abandoned houses are returning to the earth in very convincing ways. They seem to be sinking into the muck while at the same time spalling stuff off. I think one of the more interesting things that's happening out there is that these two flanking salt ponds, A20 and A21, have been breached and are now open to tidal flow. And that's only been going on for about a year. So here are the old buildings next to the track, the pond in the distance. This outhouse just sort of blew over at some point. And you see the skeleton of a roof and images of Drawbridge back during a better day when people did market hunting in a lot of cases. So here's a breach in the salt ponds. That one's on the west, and here's the eastern ponds breach. And so it's now under full tidal flow. And I've been watching, this is what it looked like when it just began, still sort of a bleach. You could imagine, I would imagine that it would take years and years for something to establish itself on what was a very salty plateau at that point. But it's starting to turn green actually quite quickly. And as soon as my permit's renewed down there, I want to get down and get a shot. This dates back to May. And I'll be curious to see what it looks like now that the summer has finished. Going just a little bit further toward Alviso, we have been stopping probably the site we visited most in the last few years. Some half dozen times a year is what we call the weep. And again, it's for its microbiological diversity. It's a little seepage that is driven by the surrounding salt ponds and has this incredibly diverse and colorful community of microbiological organisms that change rapidly over time. It's a place that'll be sort of thriving at one moment, and then it dries out, and then it comes back. And it's really interesting to try to understand the cycles that it goes through. The dominant organisms are changing as it goes through time. And so here's the weep comes, the railroad track's up here, it seeps down from the railroad track and from this other side and then gathers and goes off that way. And so we've been enjoying visiting it. I like it just in terms of photographic texture. These are the tracks of wading birds and what was a fine silty sort of muck, and then come back not too long afterwards, and that's dried up and all gone away and becoming caked mud. Or here, the verge of the mud in August 2006, December, and March 2007. And just watching how that changes as time goes past. That hike sort of ends up down at Alviso, which used to be the port of San Jose, which is sort of hard to imagine when you look at it in its current silted-in state. But the old photographs are pretty compelling. And with that termination, I'm going to draw it to a close. I would say that I have about these photographs and thousands others, a couple of thousand others, on Flickr. So if you go to Flickr or just go into Google and search for KAP Chris, C-R-I-S, those will pop up. And you can sort of browse through. Flickr now has a map interface, and I've gotten a number of them sort of posted in Flickr's Yahoo map mashup. And so you could go at it in this sort of geographic form, if you like. With that, I'll close, and I'd be delighted to take questions. Yes?
So what kind of suggestions have you gotten from your colleagues, that your geomorphological friends, all math cohorts, have they said, oh, you should do this, try this, check this out, or been let alone and let your own, knowing that best to let your experience guide you?
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question. And the question is, well, what comes to me in terms of guidance from geomorphologists or perhaps others? Hydrologists. And it comes from all over the place. I thought about showing, but I had a limited amount of time. I had a 3-month collaborative project with Paul Dubevic in computer science, in which we used images to do a 3-dimensional model of the campus and then an animation that flew around that model. I spent a lovely day talking to a person who was a geographer about photographically mapping the breathing holes in water hyacinth mats for manatees in Costa Rica, which what I would have loved to have done. It didn't quite pan out. Similarly with an archaeologist about doing some tomb shots for the Chachapoyan culture on the eastern side of the Andes. And so it's one of those things where every month somebody contacts me about something. A lot of it's not possible, I'm afraid, just due to time. So what I try to do is get them equipped or connected with other people. The project this month is whipsnake habitat in Tilden. Who knew there were whipsnakes? I went up and photographed this habitat that they're about to burn for habitat improvement. And I finally asked, well, how many whipsnakes are here along this whole ridgeline? They think maybe 6. So I hope to see one. Yeah. Yeah?
You mentioned permits. You get special permission from Cargill to go down and take those photographs?
I haven't yet, I'm afraid. So I've been sort of teasing around the periphery of Cargill. And I would love to do this. This is sort of my weekend thing, and so Cargill's often not in operation when I'm down there. I've actually flown over their plant when no one was much there. I do have a permit from the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge because they don't allow kite flying for fear that the birds would interpret the kite as a predator. But I went and did a demonstration and shared my images with them, and they thought, oh yeah, no, it's okay. Similarly, I would like to establish a relationship with the California Department of Fish and Game for their Eden Preserve, because the last time I went there, it's probably a year and a half ago, I had previously been able to go without crossing a posted sign, but now it's well signed and I can't, I need to get permission. And then Cargill I would dearly like to do. My next shot is going to be the Santa Clara waste treatment plant, which I think would be a lot of fun to shoot. Geometry with purpose. Yes?
This is not meant to be criticism at all, but isn't what you're doing really like performance art? That you can do the exact same thing with a helicopter. You can be taking pictures at 3 meters. But is there anything fundamentally different about the photos that you get I mean, aside from the fact that there's a performance element.
That was nice and loud, so I think people heard the question. And I love the performance part. I talked about the social dimension of it. But I also think it's a medium that in a lot of ways is better than a helicopter or a fixed-wing aircraft. And I've talked to a lot of helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft pilots that hovering at 3 feet, you're severely disturbing the environment that you're photographing. It's very difficult to do that. That's one of the bugaboos down at Don Edwards is they don't let helicopters down lower because of the wash. It's also very expensive to hover in a helicopter. So the Whipsnake folks in Tilden have access to a helicopter without really rental fees, and they can't afford the fuel to run it for their purposes. I think, and architecturally, I would note that I can do sort of hang a camera right next to a building or right next to something that is immobile without fear of hurting it very much, where a helicopter in that kind of proximity would be problematic. The difficulty with fixed-wing aircraft is velocity. As you get closer to the ground, you have a relatively high velocity. So I don't know. I think of this technique as being particularly appropriate for 2 meters to 40 meters out. And then beyond that, I would grant you the fixed-wing or helicopter platform argument. But I think closer than 40 meters, there's some pretty compelling things to having this nice sort of gentle, stable kite that doesn't move around very much. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Sort of along that line, is anybody doing hot air balloons?
Yeah, there's a lot of balloon kite discussion. And it may be, for me, as simple as I'm an afternoon person. That with balloons, you really seek still air. And that's most readily found in the early morning hours. I think there were actually a pair of archaeologists that did a wonderful book called An Aerial Atlas of Ancient Crete, Myers and Myers out of Pennsylvania. And at one point, they talked about donating their rather large helium blimp. They used it to lift medium format cameras. And ultimately, we didn't accept that donation because we didn't feel like we'd be able to use it well. And here's the rub. The rub is to fill up that 20-something foot blimp to do a fair payload. You're putting something on the order of $220, $250 these days of helium into the blimp. So at the end of the day, if you're well funded, you could release that to the atmosphere, though there are issues about how large our supply of helium is and whether that's a good way to use it. If you're not going to dump it to the atmosphere, it'll leak out slowly over time, typically. You need to store that large object. So you need a trailer. If you got a trailer, you got to have a vehicle to pull the trailer around and place to park it and so forth. So I think for my purposes, it wasn't practical. If it were more of a business or a funded enterprise, it might be.
How far out horizontally can you sometimes put the kite out?
One of the real tricks is just flying the kites a bit. And so I carry 1,000 feet of line. FAA says that I should not go above 500 feet. Section 109, subsection D. And so I stay low, and that's fine with me because the good photographs are low. But if I want to go way out, what I'll use is an underpowered kite. I'll pick from the 5 in my bag. Instead of the one that'll fly strongly, I'll pick one that flies a little weakly, and then it'll fly out horizontally. If I want to fly really steeply, I'll try to get an overpowered one or one that I can tune. And so there are options in the kite that you select that allow you to position. Similarly, I've got 2 camera rigs over here. One's about 1 pound, one's closer to 3. If you really wanted to stay low, maybe you put on the heavy camera rig. If you want to fly high and the conditions are marginal, you put on the light one. So question here, and then one in the back. Yeah.
On for vibration and composition, what percentage success do you have?
I'm using automatic exposure and automatic focus, which I think are very reliable these days. And technically, 95%. And the trick there is, unlike Arthur Batu, the French farmer who put the camera directly on the kite, I attach the camera to the kite line about 50 meters below the kite. And so it's hanging from the kite line around the kite. And I'm using a cross that connects strings and pulleys. So basically next to 2 points of the kite line down to 4 points in a cross with these beautiful little ball bearing pulleys or sailing blocks from radio control sailboats. And it uses the mass of the camera to level the camera relative to the horizon. That's also a vibration dampening exercise. When I first began, I used O-rings. I used some vibration stoppers, basically, on the lines. And I found you really just don't need it. There's a question in the back.
Any stereo photography?
I do, and I have built one stereo rig back when it was film. I found of late with digital cameras, because I'm taking a fair number of photographs, that I get serendipitous stereo pairs. If I want a stereo pair, I'll just point it downward and I'll shoot 5 really quickly, and 2 of those will work out very nicely. So I've got, on Flickr, I've got some stereo pairs posted. My favorite is taken about 10 feet above the newly glazed conservatory over at Golden Gate Park, where it had really steady wind, and I was able to put a camera immediately over its apex. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering about when you say that you're sort of putting out a hypothesis about what a landscape looks like. How many photos do you basically throw away or disregard? What's the percentage there?
In the film days, and I shot about 700 and something rolls of film before I really shifted to digital, I would count on a roll of 36 of having 4 or 5 keepers. And while I didn't have to bracket in terms of exposure, I did bracket compositionally. So I'd try to line something up, which is the shot I thought I was getting, and then I would bracket either side. And so there was redundancy in those compositionally bracketed exposures. In the digital world, you can send up rather than pulling down and reloading after 36 images, you can send up a camera and take 500 images. I don't know that this is a good thing. I have, of late, I've been really fascinated in terms of stitching panoramas together, and have been able to stitch 360 degrees or to get some very large images by merit of putting individual images together. So where the digital camera might give me a 3,000 pixel wide image, when I'm stitching multiple images together, maybe I get a 12,000 pixel images, which I could print large. And so I'm shooting a lot of images with the hope of stitching. But I think, by and large, the thinking through the shot's the better thing to do. Yes?
I have two questions.
Okay.
When you said this device was based on turn of the century stuff, what century was that?
19th turning to the 20th.
And the second question is that picture of the San Francisco earthquake.
Yes.
Did you try to figure out where he flew his kite from?
We have. There's been a lot of discussion about it, and it was recreated on the centennial of the quake. And so they pegged it down. It was about 1,200 feet out toward Yerba Buena Island. Yep. Yes?
Are you able to control for altitude very well?
One of the things up here is a hypsometer, which is basically a laser rangefinder that also shoots the angle. It comes from forestry. And so with that, if I'm really trying to locate myself in three-dimensional space, I can shoot this and it does the trig for me. You can get it set up to project into a horizontal plane, what's the horizontal distance out, or vertical, which will give you your altitude. I don't use it very much, however. Okay, let's take one more and then we'll wrap up. If people want to come look at this stuff at the end.
Just the inevitable Charlie Brown question. If you lost any kite/cameras that had, that had the picture on it?
Yeah, the quick synopsis, I haven't lost any pictures that I know of. I've lost 2 cameras. One was at China Camp. It went in the bay. And I had to let it go in the bay. I was hauling it in furiously because the wind had gone away. And a whole family came and sort of stood in front of me. And I would have had to pull the camera through kids sitting on people's shoulders and so forth. So I let it go in the bay. A digital camera, I threw it in the picnic cooler, got it in fresh water, take the battery and memory cards out, flush it with water, should be distilled, but I just used tap water, bake it overnight at 135, and it came back fairly nicely. It was a little soft in focus. I thought about selling it on eBay as a senior portrait elf. And I didn't. The other one sort of ties much more closely to your Charlie Brown connection. And I was at University of Virginia for a week, lectures and so forth, working pretty hard. Really wanted to get photographs. I was staying in one of Jefferson's pavilions in the academical village. Finally had a little spot of time. Conditions weren't good. I probably shouldn't have done it. Gusty, gray. I sort of got a kite up through the trees, way up over a pavilion. Had taken a couple of dozen photographs. And a spar in the kite broke. And the kite becomes unaerodynamic at that point. It ended up in a historic tree. And the camera came and just barely sort of kissed one of the Jefferson's pavilions, but enough to torque its lens over so it wouldn't retract. And arborists are my friends. I like arborists a lot. We chat. And so, you know, an arborist will zip up a tree, in this case, the historic tree, and $50 later, I've got my kite back. Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Yep.